I woke up to the warm weight of Grayson's arm draped over me, his body wrapped around mine like a protective shield. My heart hammered in my chest, the rapid thudding echoing in my ears as I took in the situation. I could feel his steady breaths against the back of my neck, each exhale sending shivers down my spine. I shut my eyes tightly, willing my heart to stop its frantic race. The memories of last night came flooding back, his quiet request for me to stay, the vulnerability in his voice, the way he held me without a word, just needing my presence. And now, here we were, entangled in a way that felt both terrifying and comforting. I swallowed hard, carefully prying myself from his hold. My movements were slow and deliberate, every inch I gained feeling like I was tiptoeing around a lion. I finally freed myself and sat up on the edge of the bed, but as I moved, my gaze fell on his face, and my breath caught in my throat. He was still asleep, his face softened in slumber, so different from the sharp, hardened look he wore during the day. The lines of tension around his eyes had smoothed out, leaving him looking almost innocent, like a child, unburdened by the weight of the world. It was a startling contrast to the man I'd come to know. For a moment, I couldn't tear my eyes away. He was my husband, this fierce, unpredictable man who had stormed into my life and turned everything upside down. Yet here he was, vulnerable in the morning light, and I couldn't help but feel something stir deep inside me. Before I could stop myself, I gently reached out, brushing a lock of hair away from his forehead. His dark hair was soft between my fingers, and I couldn't help but wonder how someone so dangerous could look so utterly peaceful. But then, without warning, his voice cut through the stillness, low and rough with sleep. "Are you done looking, wife?" I gasped, my heart leaping into my throat as his words sent a jolt of shock through me. I tried to scramble off the bed, but before I could move an inch, his hand shot out, catching my wrist in a firm grip. I turned back, my eyes wide, and nearly fainted when I saw what looked like a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. His eyes were still closed, but there was an undeniable amusement in his voice as he spoke again. "Where do you think you're going, wife?" I froze, unsure of what to say or do. My pulse quickened, a mix of panic and confusion flooding my senses. He didn't give me a chance to respond. With a gentle but insistent tug, he pulled me back into the bed, his arms wrapping around me in a possessive hold. "I still want you close," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. His grip was firm but not harsh, more possessive than aggressive, and the weight of it made my pulse race even faster. I lay stiffly in his arms, my mind racing. The warmth of his body pressed against mine made it hard to focus, the steady rhythm of his breathing lulling me into a dangerous sense of comfort. My heart continued to race, but I didn't resist. For reasons I couldn't explain, I let myself relax, sinking into his embrace as his hold tightened around me. This closeness. It was confusing and overwhelming, but at that moment I didn't want to pull away. Grayson's voice broke the silence again, quieter this time, almost hesitant. In all these years, last night was the first time I had a good sleep. His words made my heart stutter, a pang of something I couldn't quite name blooming in my chest. He paused for a long moment, as if gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I'm sorry." Those two words caught me off guard. My breath hitched as I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of his face. His eyes were still closed, but his expression had shifted. There was a weight to his features now, a burden that clung to every word he spoke. "I'm sorry for not staying by your side in the hospital," he said softly, his voice raw with emotion. At that moment, I didn't know what to do. I felt lost. I felt miserable, hopeless, and guilty. The pain in his words was undeniable, and it seeped into my heart like a slow poison. He continued, his grip on me tightening just slightly as if to anchor himself. "Because I thought I thought you had a hand in losing my son." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, reopening the wound I had been desperately trying to heal. Tears welled in my eyes, but I fought them back, not wanting to let him see how deeply his confession cut me. I couldn't bring myself to speak, so I remained silent, waiting for him to finish. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "Now I see that. And now I wish I could give you back the life you lost, because of my rage, because of my mistake in thinking you were her." My chest tightened painfully as he spoke those last words. I bit my lip, trying to hold back the sob that threatened to escape. The weight of his confession pressed down on me, suffocating, yet laced with an odd sense of relief. He knew. He knew the truth now. But could his apology truly erase everything that had happened? The silence stretched between us, heavy and thick with unsaid words. I couldn't bring myself to respond, too overwhelmed by the flood of emotions coursing through me. Instead, I closed my eyes, letting his warmth surround me as the tears I had been holding back silently fell. He went silent again for a good moment, his gaze turning distant, as if he were wrestling with something deep inside. When he finally spoke again, his voice was steady, but the words he said made my heart nearly stop. "I'm ready to set you free." I stared at him, frozen. "I'll talk to your brothers," he added quietly, "and apologize to them for everything." His words hung in the air, each one a blow that sent my mind spiraling. Set me free? Apologize to my brothers? The weight of his statement was too much to process, and I felt like I was sinking, unable to breathe. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, and I struggled to keep up with the sudden turn this conversation had taken. Grayson shifted beside me, his intense gaze never leaving my face. "What did you want us to talk about last night?" he asked softly, his voice pulling me back to the moment. But I couldn't respond. His earlier words still echoed in my mind, drowning out everything else. He was ready to set me free. Free from him. Free from this chaotic, twisted life we'd been forced into. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. All I could do was stare into his big ocean blue eyes, lost in the storm that brewed behind them. Before I could gather my thoughts, a voice broke through the stillness from outside the door, snapping me back to reality. "Ari!" Matthew's voice called. "Are you in there?" I stiffened, my eyes widening as the sound of a knock followed. "Ari, are you in here?" Matthew asked again, this time closer to the door. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the door creaked open and Matthew popped his head inside. His eyes landed on me first, and then they moved to Grayson, lying beside me. Matthew's smile widened, mischievous as ever. "Oh, I see. Sorry, sis. I thought you were alone since it's been days without seeing your husband." I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks as Grayson released me and shifted onto his back, one arm resting over his head, his expression unreadable. I quickly turned to Matthew, my heart racing again, though this time for a very different reason. But he had already closed the door behind him. I turned to Grayson to apologize for my brother's behavior, but before I could even start, the door swung open once more, and Matthew popped his head in again, his grin even wider. "Brother-in-law," he called out, his tone serious. "I hope you didn't have sex with my sister because she's not yet healed." My face burned with embarrassment, and I shot up in bed, glaring at my brother. "Matt, stop!" I yelled, my tone filled with exasperation. But Matthew wasn't one to be easily deterred. He ignored my warning, continuing with his relentless questioning. "Well, did he or didn't he? Did you two?" Without thinking, I rushed toward him, grabbing his arm and slapping my hand over his mouth before he could finish that sentence. "Enough!" I hissed, dragging him out of the room, his muffled protest sounding behind my hand. I glanced back at Grayson, who now lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling with a mixture of amusement and irritation. "I'm sorry," I called over my shoulder, apologizing to Grayson as I pulled Matthew fully into the hallway. Once we were out of the room, I shoved Matthew into my room across the hall and slammed the door behind us, my hands on my hips as I fixed him with a glare. "What is wrong with you?" I demanded, my voice low but furious. Matthew grinned, entirely unbothered by my anger. "Just making sure my little sister is okay. Got to look out for you, you know." I groaned, shaking my head. "You're impossible." He shrugged. "That's what brothers are for." I smiled and pulled my brother into a tight embrace, grateful for his presence and the comfort it offered. As I held him, my mind reeled back at Grayson's words. "Set me free." My thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm, unable to hold on to any one feeling. A part of me should have felt relieved, but all I could manage was confusion. I had dreamed of freedom, of being away from him and all the complications he brought into my life. But now, hearing those words from him, all I felt was confusion. It was as if the very thing I had wished for was wrapped in a veil of uncertainty and pain. Why did the prospect of freedom hurt so much? I sat at the dining table, absent-mindedly stirring my spoon through the bowl of oatmeal in front of me. The sounds of clinking utensils and quiet chatter filled the room, but my mind was elsewhere. Every few minutes, my eyes would dart toward the door, scanning the hallway for any sign of Grayson. But he never appeared. Why was I waiting for him? The question kept gnawing at me, yet I had no answer. Maybe it was because of what he'd said earlier. Maybe I just needed to see him to understand if he really meant it, if he was truly ready to let me go. I chewed on my bottom lip, the taste of breakfast completely lost on me. Across the table, Matthew was happily shoveling food into his mouth, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I didn't know how he could be so carefree, especially after barging into Grayson's room earlier, like a bull in a china shop. "You gonna eat that or just stare at it?" he mumbled through a mouthful of toast, raising an eyebrow as he motioned toward my untouched food. I barely heard him, my focus once again shifting toward the hallway. No Grayson. A small knot of frustration twisted in my chest, but I shook it off, determined not to let my emotions get the best of me. I stabbed my spoon into the oatmeal with more force than necessary, the bowl sliding an inch across the table. Matthew snorted, his face stuffed with another bite. "You're going to get a stiff neck if you keep staring at that door," he said with his mouth full, his words garbled but the teasing tone unmistakable. "Just go get him yourself." I shot him a glare, my cheeks flushing. "I'm not waiting for him," I lied, my voice defensive as I tried to focus on my breakfast. "Yeah, right." Matthew rolled his eyes, barely pausing to chew as he continued. "You've been looking at that door like it's going to magically open any second now. Why not just admit you want your husband here?" Matthew leaned back in his chair, posing dramatically as he eyed me with a smirk. He crossed his arms, studying my face before speaking. "Could your husband possibly be mad because I walked in on you guys earlier?" he asked, his voice half serious, half amused. I stirred my spoon again, my thoughts drifting far from his words. "Not really," I muttered, my response more automatic than thoughtful. "All right then," Matthew replied, leaning forward now, his elbows resting on the table. "So why isn't he having breakfast with us?" The knot of frustration in my chest tightened. I turned to him, my voice sharper than I intended. "Can you stop talking about him and just enjoy your breakfast? He's probably not hungry." I stabbed the spoon into the oatmeal again, trying to suppress the irritation bubbling up inside me. Matthew raised his eyebrows and lifted his hands in a gesture of surrender, his fork clattering onto his plate. "Whoa, okay, there's no need to bite my head off." He paused, watching me carefully for a moment, before lowering his voice to a calm, whispery tone. "But why are you angry?" I froze, his question cutting through the haze of my thoughts. Angry? I wasn't sure if that was the right word. Frustrated, maybe. Confused, definitely. But angry? I hadn't even realized it was showing. I sighed heavily, the weight of Matthew's question settling uncomfortably on my chest. "I've lost my appetite," I muttered, pushing my chair back as I stood up. "I'll go make myself busy with something else." Matthew shrugged, unfazed by my sudden departure. "As you wish," he said, returning his attention to his plate as if the conversation had never happened. I walked out of the dining room, my mind a swirl of thoughts. Without really thinking about where I was going, my feet led me upstairs, instinctively heading toward Grayson's room. My chest tightened as I reached his door, but when I pushed it open, I was met with the sight of a maid straightening the bed. The maid turned and smiled politely. "Good morning, Mrs. Anderson." "Good morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you know where Grayson is?" "Mr. Anderson left for work earlier this morning," she replied with a respectful nod. Of course he did. I should have expected that. My heart sank a little, even though I had no reason to be surprised. It seemed that no matter what happened between us, he was always 2 steps ahead, always slipping out of reach. I nodded to the maid, forcing a polite smile. "Thank you," I said, retreating back into the hallway, my mind still swirling with thoughts of Grayson. As I stood at the top of the staircase, I spotted Florence below, briskly walking across the foyer with a stack of papers in her hands. Without thinking, I rushed down the stairs, calling out her name. "Florence!"
She halted mid-step, turning around to face me with a raised brow. "Yes, Mrs. Anderson?" Her tone was flat, but there was a hint of impatience in her eyes. "How may I help you?" I approached her, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. Florence's brows furrowed slightly as she regarded me with a mix of surprise and a hint of disdain. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Anderson, but there's nothing you and I need to talk about," she replied curtly, taking a step back. "So, if you'll excuse me..." Before she could finish her sentence and walk away, I cut her off, my voice sharper. "Is that really true?" I pressed, studying her face for any flicker of reaction. "When Grayson brought me into this house, you seemed scared, worried even. You acted as if you had a clue about my escape from this place." That seemed to hit a nerve. She froze, her eyes widening slightly before narrowing with barely concealed fury. Slowly, she turned back toward me, her gaze cold and piercing. Without a word, she grabbed my wrist, her grip tighter than necessary, and dragged me down the hall. My heart raced as she led me into the bedroom that smelled like her, slamming the door behind us and locking it. She dropped the stack of papers on the makeup vanity with a loud thud before picking up a glass of water and taking a long, deliberate sip. She turned to face me, her eyes burning with anger, and without warning, she slapped me, hard. The force of it sent a shockwave through me, my cheek stinging as I staggered back. Her voice was low, venomous. "If you ever say something like that again, I will kill you, young woman." I stared at her, stunned into silence, my hand instinctively going to my cheek where the sting of her slap still lingered. I stood there for a moment, too stunned to move. My cheek burned where she had slapped me, but the pain was nothing compared to the shock of her sudden change in demeanour. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe, trying to wrap my mind around what had just happened. Slowly, I lowered my hand from my cheek, my voice shaky but steady enough to ask, What was that all about?" "You shouldn't be asking questions you don't want the answers to," she said quietly, her voice dripping with cold warning. The old woman's eyes flickered with a cruel glint as she stepped closer, her voice lowering to a near whisper, dripping with malice. "You don't owe me an explanation, Ms. Ariana Winslow." My heart skipped a beat, freezing in place. How did she know my real name? I opened my mouth to ask, but before I could, she cut me off with an icy smirk. "Don't look so surprised. Mr. Anderson tells me everything, just like he told me you're not his wife." Her lips curled into a mocking smile as she watched the shock flicker across my face. "It was a mistake," she continued, as though the words were an afterthought. "A mistake he couldn't take back because by the time he realised it, you were already pregnant." My thoughts were spinning, trying to keep up with her words, but she didn't give me a chance to process. She continued, her voice laced with poison. "But now that the child who kept you here is gone," she said, her tone hardening, "it's your time to leave as well. Before the worst comes, a worst you won't love, trust me." She took a step closer, her cold gaze locking onto mine. The air seemed to thicken with her presence, each step she took heightening the oppressive tension in the room. "I'm sure you're wise enough not to mention what just happened here to Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice low and menacing. The threat was clear, and the unspoken promise of dire consequences hung heavily in the air. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my mind still reeling from the revelations. Her words had left me paralysed with fear and questions.